human progress it's been a bit sluggish for the bulk of human history. Scholars who study income and measurable levels of well-being over time notice little growth over many millennia. According to some estimates, daily inflation-adjusted income per person hovered at around $1 or $2 for much of human history. And if there was any growth, it was rather anemic. Some estimates have it at approximately 0.2% per person per year in England over much of the second millennium. Over the past 200 years, however, the amount of goods the world has produced, the amount of income people earned, and the number of people have all grown exponentially. Standards of living have grown vastly worldwide. The number of persons living in abject poverty on the planet has declined precipitously, especially over the past 30 or 40 years. And many scholars will trot out statistics about this. For instance, one think tank produced this graph that is tracking GDP per person in the world and in Europe and the United States from the year 1000 to the year 2000. Now, economists might dispute some of the measurement methodology, but most social scientists seem to agree on the general trend line. Things were pretty flat worldwide until the Industrial Revolution, and then suddenly things started changing. The details of how and why it changed are still disputed by social scientists. The United States has shown impressive growth in income and living standards over the past 200 years. Plus, the ease with which persons in the United States can rise out of poverty is something that seems to be an opportunity that forms part of our national self-understanding. Words to this effect are displayed at the Statue of Liberty, which, as many of us know, encourages the world to send here its huddled and wretched masses yearning for better opportunities. But many people worry that the opportunities are unavailable to considerable segments of our population, or if they are available, they are inferior opportunities. Indeed, if you take a look at many of the measures of growth over the past 20 years alone, it seems income inequality has grown and mobility on many measures is flat or declining, especially for those demographics that historically have not been part of the rising tide. Of special note is how access to key opportunities needed for social, political, and economic advancement, notably that of education, is unequally unavailable. And this generates not just policy challenges, but moral challenges in terms of what persons are entitled to, what persons owe to one another, our relationship with the state, and how best to secure our entitlements. Our experts today continue the conversation about how to understand and grapple with the challenges of recent changes in social mobility in the United States. We are privileged to have with us 6 experts who will offer their thoughts. Our format is as follows. We will begin with 2 featured speakers, each of whom will speak for 12 to 15 minutes, and thereafter we have assembled a panel of 4 expert respondents who will offer some off-the-cuff thoughts about some of the themes that have come up, and then we will open it up to general discussion. Our scholars and experts each have a distinguished record of achievement, and I encourage you to note their achievements in the brief bios on the brochure that we have distributed. We begin with Professor Derrick Darby, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan. His remarks are titled, "Schooling Inequality, Why America is Not a Land of Equal Opportunity for Everyone." Please join me in welcoming Professor Darby.
Thank you. So I spent all of my day today over at the King Archive, and I brought back something for us to get started today. In March of 1965, at the end of the historic march from Selma to Montgomery, on the steps of the state capitol, Dr. King urged the masses gathered in Montgomery to continue the triumphant march to the realization of the American dream. He told them that this involves marching on segregated schools, until every vestige of segregated and inferior education becomes a thing of the past, and Negroes and whites studying side by side in the socially healing context of the classroom. America is and has always been a land of opportunity, though opportunities have been grossly unequal and dreams have not been evenly realized. Schooling inequality or unequal education has been a long-standing obstacle to the realization of the American dream. I grew up in Queensbridge housing projects, which is an iconic neighborhood in the history of hip-hop for all my hip-hop heads out there. But it is also a place that fits the profile far too common for many communities across the country. Racial segregation, poverty, high rates of unemployment, crime, single-family homes, inadequate schools, parents without higher education, and the list goes on. If we accept the findings of economists, sociologists, and other social scientists, then we are to believe that kids from such neighborhoods are much less likely than others to climb the ladder of opportunity in America. Of course, I climbed the ladder of opportunity, and my story, while not unique, is certainly an exception rather than the rule. Education reformers going back to Horace Mann have long argued that education is the great equalizer, the way to level the playing field between the haves and the have-nots. Educational achievement and attainment have certainly been pathways to opportunity and upward social mobility in America. That was true when public education was established in the 19th century, and it's certainly true now. But it was also true then, and it's true now, that opportunities to follow the educational pathway and achieve upward mobility have not been the same for everyone. They have been grossly unequal. And the differences have had and continue to have far-reaching ramifications given the intrinsic and instrumental value of education in our society. Now, it is tempting to think that Brown versus Board of Education and the great civil rights acts of the 60s solved this problem for us. But sadly, as many of us know, this is not the case. Brown said that it was unlawful for the state to segregate schools on the basis of race. But it did not outlaw, nor is it clear that it could have or should have outlawed other ways of giving a serious advantage on the playing field to some and not to others. Some of the very rich research that has been done within the social sciences takes account of the relationship between family characteristics, such as a mother's level of education, income of the parents, and measure how these predict a child's achievement. And educational achievement, cognitive skills, and educational attainment, they tell us, predict how much money people will make. If this is right, here is another pernicious way in which the rich get richer by moving up the ladder of opportunity, while others without resources fall farther behind. I take it that many people in this room are rich, of course not Donald Trump rich, but rich with opportunity and having benefited from opportunity. This is an institution of higher learning. We're all here as educators or being educated. But there are going to be many that we have left behind, much like some I left behind in Queensbridge in New York. Friends and family that have not been able to get on that pathway to opportunity that education provides. I was one of the lucky ones, as I'm sure some of you were as well. But this is a situation that we must certainly deal with if we're going to be serious about realizing the promise of the American dream. Now, although we can talk about essentially class-related factors, in my own research, I still want to pay close attention to race and the role that it continues to play in shaping educational opportunity and keeping the playing field anything but level. So very briefly, I want to just tell you about a project that I'm just finishing up with a colleague, John Rory, a book on the origins of the achievement gap and why they matter for justice. And basically what we want to do in this book is chart the relationship between racial ideology as it played out in America for much of its history, the idea that blacks were inferior to whites in terms of intelligence, character, and conduct, and how this ideology shaped the nature of education for blacks and whites throughout American history. In the first instance, blacks, of course, were not allowed to go to school. And then when they were allowed to go to school, they were provided education on very unequal terms. Or they were provided education that was essentially aimed at making them servile and subordinate to whites. And what we do is we show how this ideology and its relationship to schooling were mutually reinforcing and have been over time. And we get to the contemporary moment by looking at sorting practices that are still taking place in our schools today. So when we look at some of the social science literature, we see that black and brown kids are disproportionately underrepresented in high track classes. They are overrepresented in the group of kids who are disciplined in school, and they're overrepresented in the category of learning disabled kids who aren't able to learn and therefore should be pulled out of the classroom. And we argue that these practices are continuing to contribute to an unequal playing field that has far-reaching ramifications. So here I've tried to just get your attention focused on something that I think we absolutely have to talk about if we're going to talk about social mobility in the United States in the 21st century, and that's education. And we need to think seriously about the ways in which education, although it promises to level the playing field, in practice, it exacerbates the differences between us. And of course, keep in mind, it's not a choice between education and no education. At this point, it's about the education that your money can buy and the education that your money can't buy. And we all know that the education that your money can buy, when you're spending a lot of money on it, creates better opportunities for your children and people who are afforded that opportunity. So I think that would be a good place for me to stop and to yield the floor to my colleague and to hopefully return to some of these issues in discussion. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor John Roemer of Yale University, where he is the Elizabeth S. and A. Varick Stout Professor of Political Science and Economics. His remarks are titled, Inequality of Opportunity for Income, What is Its True Extent? Please join me in welcoming Professor Roemer.
How do we get this up here?
Is it this one? Policy one?
Yeah, what do you click?
All right. There you go.
Yeah.
You just click that right arrow.
And is one of these a pointer?
I'm afraid not.
There's no pointer, huh?
No. Yeah. I can point for you. That's how they point.
I think the most significant development in political philosophy in the last third of the 20th century was recognizing the role that responsibility should play in egalitarian theory. And this was developed by a number of philosophers. John Rawls was the most famous, who published a book called A Theory of Justice in 1971. Ronald Dworkin was a law professor who published important work on this in the early 80s. G.A. Cohen, a philosopher at Oxford University, and others. And the basic idea is rather simple. It's that the outcomes for individuals are a product of two kinds of things, attributes. One are circumstances beyond their control, and the other are voluntary decisions that people make. Circumstances are conditions, social conditions, biological conditions, which the individual can't be held responsible for. And let's call that voluntary choices people make the effort that they make. Equality of opportunity is said to hold when outcomes depend only upon effort. That is to say, the effects of circumstances beyond the control of people have been sterilized through policy and explicitly, for instance, through education. So it's unfair, the theory here goes that it's unfair or unjust if the path of success that you have in life is determined largely by things that you can't control, such as the kind of family you were born into, the country you were born into, and so on, and that the just situation is one in which people's success, or their income in the most simple measure of it, but their success more generally, responds to their own efforts rather than being controlled or dictated by circumstances over which they have no control. So, importantly, I think for this discussion, and referring to what Professor Darby said, the circumstance of the family in which a person is born and all the implications that has is a very important one, and we use policy, in particular education, but other policies as well, to try to compensate people who have disadvantageous background, few resources from their families, so that they have a better chance of achieving success. So let me give a very concrete illustration here. Apparently I don't have a pointer, so it's going to be hard for me to explain these graphs. This is, I'm starting with an example from Ecuador. And these are income distributions. They're called the distribution functions, or the cumulative distribution functions of 7 groups in Ecuador. And let me try to explain. Let's look at the left-hand one, the dark one on the left. If you look at that blue line in the middle, oh, there, I do have a pointer. Is that coming out? Yeah, it is. Okay, good. So this is the 50% mark. So this graph, this axis goes from 0 to 100%. And the graph measures the fraction of people in this group whose incomes are given by this percentage. So here at 50%, this is saying in this particular group, who I'll describe what the group is in a minute, about half of the people have incomes less than 3,000 a year. I don't know, 3,000, whatever the unit is in Ecuador, pesos, I don't remember exactly what it is. So about half of these people have an income less than 3,000. If you look at this group over here, about half of this group have an income less than 12,000. So if you had to choose the group you wanted to be in, you would choose the most right-hand group. That's the best off group, right? So these income distributions get unambiguously worse as you move in this direction. Unambiguously better, I'm sorry. These are the people with the worst income distribution, the worst chances in life, so to speak, and these are the people with the best. Now, what are these groups? These are young men, age 30 to 40, say, and put into groups based upon the level of education of their parents. So we have 7 groups here. What we did, we had a data set in which we had reported the income of these workers and the level of education of both their parents. So we divided, so there were 4 levels of education for the mother and 4 levels of education for the father, and we combined those into 7 groups. This group here, these are the young men, the workers, whose parents had no primary education. So you see, if you grew up in a family whose parents, both of your parents had not even primary education, your chances aren't very good for earning income. This describes the chances you have. Whereas this group over here on the right, it's very light because, just because of the coding, these are the workers whose parents both had at least some tertiary education. And so as we move from here to here, the parents get more and more educated. And you see that perfectly partitions the opportunities that are available to the children in the sense of the income distributions that they're going to draw from. So what would equality of opportunity require in this picture? Equality of opportunity would require that the distributions be very close together. That would mean that it wouldn't matter very much what your parents' education was in terms of your own future chances. Not true in Ecuador, obviously. A lot of inequality of opportunity there. This is an interesting picture. It's from Brazil. And here, there are just, this is a very sensitive computer here. There are 3 groups that we're only looking at. We're looking at white workers in Brazil, black workers, and workers of mixed race. Okay? And we're looking at the income distribution of those 3 groups. You might think there are 2 groups here, but there are really 3 because there's both a green line and there's both a green curve and a blue curve here. This is the income distribution. Remember, the further to the right the distribution is, the better off those people are, right? The red line is the distribution function of income of the white workers. And the green and the blue lines, which are coincident, they look like the same line, are the income distributions of blacks and mixed race workers. So the interesting thing about Brazil is there's essentially no, Brazil often has the reputation of being a non-racial society. It's not non-racial in the sense that the whites do unambiguously better than people of color, but there's no particular racism against blacks, people of African descent. That is to say, whether you're black or of mixed race, your income distribution is about the same. So I think that's why Brazil has this reputation for being a non-racial society. It's not, in fact, non-racial. There are advantages to being white in Brazil, but there's no particular disadvantage to being of African descent versus mixed race. Okay, here's a picture from Uganda, very much the same as Ecuador. These are 4 income distributions for groups of workers defined as a function of the parents' education. The yellow group, these people, these are the workers whose parents had post-primary education, at least they had some high school. These are the green group are the ones whose parents had completed primary but nothing beyond. The red group, some primary, and the blue group, the parents had no education at all. Again, a very sharp demonstration of the fact of how these circumstances impact upon the chances of people. Now here's a country that's done a lot to redistribute income and to attack these problems. This is Denmark. These are 3 groups, again, male workers, and with 3 groups defined by the level of education of the parents. It makes very little difference in Denmark how much education your parents had in terms of the income distribution that's going to be available to you. So this is a country that has virtually eliminated inequality of opportunity due to the level of education of your parents. And I've got these for many, many countries, and it pretty much conforms to what you'd guess. The Northern European countries, the social democracies, there's very little inequality of opportunity. In other countries, there's much more. Italy, there's much more inequality of opportunity than in Denmark. This is the United States. This is 2007. These are 4 groups based upon, again, the education of the parents. So the light, this group here, chartreuse, whatever this color is, they're the workers whose parents have some college education. These are the ones whose parents, maybe these are the ones who have a parent who graduated from college. These are the ones whose parents just had some college but didn't graduate. These are the ones whose parents just finished high school, and these are the ones who have a parent that their parents had only primary school education. So again, a clear violation of equality of opportunity. Here's the same picture for 4 groups of black workers. Here, it's interesting to note that if your parents had some college education, that's this group down here. It's very sparse in the data. It's not a full curve, but these people are significantly better off than the other 3 groups. So there doesn't seem to be much difference in opportunity if your parents had less than college education. And here we put the 2 together, and if you analyze this graph, you can see that the sons of the most advantaged black group do about as well as the sons of white parents in the second most disadvantaged type. What fraction of an inequality is explained by parental education and race? Well, surprisingly, only about 20% in the United States. So it might appear that a lot of inequality is due to effort. However, there are lots of missing circumstances. There are lots of circumstances that are important besides parental education and race. And in other work that we've done, we have gotten data sets which have a rather thick description of the accomplishments of children, of these workers who are now earning a wage and in the labor market when they were children, their performance in school, their health as youngsters, lots of details about the parental behavior, such as whether the parents took drugs or abused alcohol. And then we find, when we look at all these circumstances which characterize the environment in which the child grows up, that we can explain about half of all inequality in terms of these circumstances. So the more circumstances you include, at all of which are beyond the control of the individual involved, you explain an awful lot of the inequality that exists. As I said, for the United States, we get about 46% of income inequality in the United States is explained by these circumstances. In Britain, the figure is smaller. It's about 36%. Britain has more of a welfare state than the United States does. It has more social insurance. Market economies, is it utopian to think that we could equalize opportunities, or at least become much more equal than we are now? Market economies reward skills regardless of where the skill comes from. It doesn't care. The market doesn't care whether your skill was due to your own effort or due to having good circumstances. This is often called meritocracy. And this must be distinguished from the equal opportunity view, which says that what people deserve to get should depend upon their efforts, not on their circumstances, not what the market does. Nevertheless, we see in the Scandinavian countries that a high degree of equality of opportunity can be achieved even in market economies by having lots of social insurance and redistribution of income. This has been achieved in the Nordic countries also through narrowing wage differentials for workers of different skill, through having a large public sector which provides both private and public goods on an egalitarian basis, and an emphasis on early childhood education. I see I'm exhausting my time, so I'm going to just get to one more example of these circumstances. A child in the United States at the age of 3 who comes from a family whose parents have gone to college, or a professional family, hears about 11.2 million words per year by the age of 3. In other words, has heard about 33 million words by the age of 3, whereas a child from a working class family hears about 6.5 million words per year, about 20 million words by the age of 3. This difference is huge, And it has a massive effect. You can imagine that it has a massive effect on the child's development of language skills and of intelligence, because learning language is an essential feature of being able to think clearly. So that's the kind of difference which exists when there's poverty, the way there is in this country, and there's unequal access to tertiary education, and there's not good enough secondary education to compensate people for the disadvantages in their backgrounds so that they can become more educated themselves. So this is the kind of thing we face, and this is why we need a tremendous, I don't want the same amount spent on all children in schools in the United States. I want much more money spent on children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So I don't think that the right educational policy is equal financing of education for everybody. I think it's far more financing in neighborhoods where children grow up in families that don't have resources to compensate them for the lack of resources in the family. Inheritance of wealth is also a practice that really comes in conflict with equality of opportunity, because it enables some families and dynasties to enjoy massively better opportunities than others over generations. If you can pass down your wealth to your children, that gives them fantastically better opportunities than children who don't have wealthy parents. Thomas Piketty, who published a very important book a couple of years ago called Capitalism in the 21st Century, has argued that inheritance will become the most important channel of wealth creation in the 21st century. Yet in this country, the Congress is toying with the idea of abolishing inheritance taxes completely. In fact, you can now, my view is that inheritance taxes should be very high, certainly above a certain level. Inheritance taxes in this economy don't begin until the parents have wealth of over $11 million, and then they start at a very low rate. So I think this idea of equality of opportunity is not only, I mean, it came out of these philosophical discussions, at least the latest version of it, but it, I think, makes a lot of sense to people, ordinary people, the man on the street, so to speak. When you ask a person, what's fair, the response that the so-called man on the street often gives is, well, it depends how hard the person tried. You see a rich person and a poor person. You say, is it fair that they have that difference in income? Well, the answer is it depends on what the genesis of the income was. If it was because one person had lots of advantages and the other had none, then it's unfair. And that's the basic idea behind the equality of opportunity work. Thank you.
Before we slide into the remarks from our distinguished panel of discussants, I wanted to mention to y'all that our two featured speakers will be giving research presentations tomorrow. Professor Roemer, whom you just heard, will be delivering a presentation, How We Do and Could Cooperate, a Kantian Approach, tomorrow at 10:30 in the Andrew Young School Building in room 749. And Professor Derrick Darby will be delivering a colloquium to the Philosophy Department, which is on 25 Park Place Northeast on the 16th floor, and that's 3 o'clock tomorrow, and that's going to be titled Tracking Injustice in Education. So next we have a panel of expert discussants, and each of them will be offering some impromptu remarks about what you've heard. Stuart Andreason, who's an economist with the Atlanta Federal Reserve, Tomeka Davis, who is a professor with GSU's Sociology Department, Daniel Creasman, who is with GSU's Economics, and Joseph Moll, who joins us from the Emmaus House in Atlanta. I guess since we're standing at the computer, why don't we start with Joseph, because I know you've got something over here.
Well, welcome, everyone. It's a privilege to be here tonight. And I just want to put a couple of images up on the screen because In the city of Atlanta, I think, as my colleagues have already mentioned, nationally and internationally, you can't separate a conversation about socioeconomic mobility from a conversation about race. And so these slides are not my own research. That's how I'll differ from my colleagues. These are somebody else's. But these were actually, this is information put together by the Annie E. Casey Foundation in a report called Changing the Odds, the Race for Results in Atlanta. So I run an organization that is in South Atlanta, in Peoplestown, just south of Turner Field. You can walk there from here. It is a neighborhood where 48% of families live in poverty. It is a neighborhood that is almost 90% African American and has historically experienced economic disinvestment since the 60s. That's the context for the work that I do, and education achievement and family economic success, working with a two-generation approach with children and families, children and their parents. But the context for that is Atlanta. So we're the home of the civil rights movement. We are a place where school desegregation went fairly smoothly as compared to other places. We're also a city that's often called the city too busy to hate. That was a slogan that was alive and well at one point. But if you look at this map, this is the city divided by race, where majority in the blue color here is African American, and the majority in the gray color is white. And what you'll see in this map is that Midtown Atlanta is the dividing line, pretty much, for that. And the neighborhood planning units, which are those letters up there, are conglomerations of neighborhoods that are part of the city governance. Any neighborhood planning unit that touches I-20 or is south of I-20 is majority African American. So a few other maps, and then I'll step down here. If you look to your left, you'll see this map about families that are earning more than 200% of the poverty level, which is they're earning more than $48,000 for a family of four, okay, per household. The darker shades of purple are where 80 to 94% of these families are earning more than 200% of the federal poverty level. And the lighter shades toward the bottom are where families are earning less than 200%. And actually, in the lightest shades, are earning 2.1 to 13.9% of the federal poverty level. That is not very much money for a family of four in a major metropolitan city. And then if you look at the other map to your right, you'll see the uptake of food stamps or the SNAP program in our city. So these maps are inverted, and they're inverted along the exact same lines, along the exact same neighborhood planning unit lines, and they hover again around Midtown, with the south side and the west side experiencing higher rates of poverty. A couple of factors that contribute that we see every day in our work with children and families in Peoplestown are, one of them is the location of jobs. So if you look at the map to your left, the darker shades of orange are the higher concentrations of jobs, okay? Those are almost all located, other than MPUX, which is the airport, just so you know. Lots of jobs by the airport. The concentration of jobs is in the north. When you look here at the green shades, those are households without cars in our city. So, where are the jobs? Where are the people with the cars? The people without the cars are not able to access the jobs. And then this last one is just about economic stability. And if you look on the yellow side over here, I just want you to notice median household income for African Americans is $26,600. For whites is $84,944. That's a $58,000 gap. It's a pretty decent salary for somebody. A whole entire salary less in the median income in our houses along race. So I think our conversation in Atlanta has to go deeper around these issues. We have to look at things, particularly if we look at this map, we have to think about things like transit, think about things like job location, and think about the things that my colleagues mentioned, which is this equality of opportunity work, and really with a racial equity lens. And racial equity doesn't mean that we give everybody equal treatment, but that we figure out how to make things more equitable by infusing resources where they are more needed, and not put so many where they're not. So.
I don't know if we have an order for this, so I'll just randomly pick. So next, how about we have Stuart Andreason, who is an economist with the Atlanta Federal Reserve. Dr. Andreason.
Excuse me. I'm at the Atlanta Fed, which is an interesting place. We spend a lot of time thinking about the labor market, but we don't have tools really that deal with a lot of the issues that we talk about today. They're of serious concern, though, and so I've got some personal thoughts, and a lot of the work that I've done is related to these issues, despite the fact that largely what our role is in terms of monetary policy is setting conditions where things can grow broadly, and then there's a hope that there will be some work to make some type of even distribution. I actually am in a unique position in that I work in our community economic development group, so my work is solely focused on low and moderate income populations. But I think that one of the questions that this forum presents today is largely about mobility, and everyone's talked a little bit about inequality, and I believe that they're very much related, but different, and few argue with the idea of mobility, which I'll call the potential for someone to move up in the income ladder, to become the next Bill Gates or the next Donald Trump. Inequality is about where everyone sits on that ladder, and the fact that a place can be highly mobile, but it may be a place that has Donald Trumps as well as people living on several dollars a day. And I think the extremes are important to consider, but it's also important to consider the spread in the middle. Beyond that, I want to talk about education a little bit, and I think that some of my fellow panelists are going to be a little bit more versed in this than I am. But Professor Darby talked about education and the hope that it has as the great equalizer. Looking at the labor market, we also know that it's the great inequalizer, in that it's the mechanism that transmits skills, which are well determined to be something that is significantly restructuring incomes and the labor market, and that people, even with college tuitions going up, are seeing returns to education rising despite the increasing cost of education. The challenge is that we know from a lot of the things that we heard already that there isn't equal access to this higher education. That's partly related to wealth, which Professor Roemer talked about. Wealth is much more difficult to study than incomes. I'd point you all to a number of studies, including some that are ongoing right now, called The Color of Wealth, and they seem to be finding what we would imagine, that the color of wealth is very different, and that minority populations have significantly lower wealth, which then leads them to be much less mobile and able to succeed in the in a skills-based economy where education may provide mobility, but it enhances inequality. These are challenges that we have to figure out. In work that I've done recently in looking at the last 3 years of the labor market, there's been significant job growth, which we've all heard about, and we've seen unemployment rates drop. About 5 million new jobs were created. I did work on what I called opportunity occupations, but you would all know them as middle-skilled jobs, jobs that paid over a regional median wage but required less than a college degree. Those jobs, in a context of 5 million job growth, declined by 1.7 million in the 100 largest metro areas in the country. So as we think about mobility, we need to think about where mobility goes to. Is it to the top, as a lot of scholars have looked at, and what happens for people that move up some and people that remain at the bottom, and how do you acknowledge that there's always going to be some spread, but it's not always the spread matters. I'll stop there.
I forgot to mention earlier that Mr. Mull was with the Emmaus House, and he has some literature available if you're curious about some of the work that his organization does. Next, how about Professor Davis from the Sociology Department of GSU.
So I scribbled some notes as everyone was talking. I'm going to have to bend down really low to read them, though. So I hope that doesn't obscure your view of me too much. I wanted to spend my time commenting on something that Dr. Darby said. So one of the things he said, which I found was interesting, he said that education exacerbates the differences between us. And it really struck me as something that is very relevant. I'm currently teaching a graduate course in the sociology of education. And one of the things that we've been finding week after week after week in all of the readings that we've been doing, so all of these pieces have been essentially saying the same things, that Black students fall further behind in school. So it's that schooling is exacerbating the racial differences in achievement. So we tend to think of schools as the great equalizer, but again, over and over we find, especially with more recent research, is that schooling disadvantages Black students. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why is this the case? And there are a lot of technical mechanisms that all of these articles are pointing out, right? That it's tracking, that it's inexperienced teachers, that it's peer influences, that it's differential resources in high minority schools. But why can't we equalize these kinds of resources across the board? So one of the problems that come up when we're thinking about inequality is this sort of need we have as humans to preserve resources for ourselves rather than share them with other people. So Randall Collins, who's a sociologist, wrote a book a really, really long time ago for a lot of you students out there in the audience. It was written in 1980. It's a book called The Credential Society. And the main question of the book was, why have educational credentials for jobs increased, right? And essentially, the conclusion that he draws is that elites, so those people at the top of the social hierarchy, in an effort to maintain their position, they're constantly ratcheting up the educational race, constantly trying to get more education as those people below them also are getting more education. How do you stay on top? You just get more, right? So, so according to this argument, elites are always going to outpace the rest of us, in part because they have the money and the political power to leave the rest of us behind. But what about those of us in the middle? So the middle class people, right? What can we do? Interestingly, also in my sociology of education class, actually last week, we read a book called Both Sides Now by a sociologist who's at Teachers College, Columbia, her name is Amy Stuart Wells. And what she did in the book was she chronicled the experiences of Black and white adults who had graduated from these very meticulously desegregated high schools in 1980. And their stories were amazing. So they talked about these amazing experiences they had in desegregated high schools and how it prepared them for real life and how it made them better people and how they were better than their friends who had gone to all white high schools. But in the end, and it's an interesting ending, in the end, when Wells asked them about, well, what are you going to do for your own children? All of the white graduates said, well, I don't really care about diversity for my own kids. I just care about the academic rigor of the program, right? It's competitive out here now, so I've got to send them to the best schools, and I don't really want to send them to desegregated high schools. So they just a complete 180 for their own children. So they wanted no part of it in the end. So they're saying, we don't want to share resources across class and race lines. But as well as respondents noted, as they said, this made us better people, this makes us better workers. So in my class, what was the conclusion that we drew with regard to the benefits of desegregation? And how can we think about this with regard to inequality of opportunity more generally in education? So the conclusion that we drew is we said that we need to eat our vegetables, right? We don't like to eat vegetables, right? They don't taste good. We don't like to eat them, but they make us healthier. And we need to think about inequality of education in the same way, that some of the things we have to do to equalize opportunity across the board, they're not necessarily convenient, but they make us better. They make us stronger. So America, we need to eat our vegetables. Thank you.
And Dan Creasman joining us from GSU's economics. Professor Creasman.
All right, let me start by thanking you all for having me here. I kind of said yes to this before I saw who was on the panel, and then when I saw who was on the panel, I got a little nervous. So I'm going to try and take kind of a middle position between kind of some of the ideas we heard and try and tie that together a little bit. I've been thinking about, what I was going to say here for the last few days. Kind of, there's a really big issues we're dealing with. It's kind of, we're talking about the American dream, and they're like, all right, you have 4 minutes. So tie that all together. And it's, I kind of think that's kind of a dangerous term to throw around. I think if I were to ask everybody here what the American dream is, I'd get a lot of subtly different answers. But at the end of the day, I think that we'd come to the conclusion we want it to be the kind of place where you end up is not too much determined by where you start. And kind of we saw a lot of evidence that, in fact, in America and in a whole bunch of other countries, where you start plays a very, very big role in where you end up. And we know in America, from a whole bunch of different, whether it's the sociological literature, the historical literature, the economic literature that I'm familiar with, we know there are really, really big differences between rich and poor folks, between black and white folks. Recent work by Raj Chetty, if you're not familiar with the technical paper, you might have seen his stuff in the New York Times, where he's going to show you a bunch of maps that say where you were born is going to have a huge effect on kind of, your outcomes later in life. We know similar stuff from work by Steve Levitt and Roland Fryer that will say at birth, between black and white kids, we don't see much difference. And by the time they're 4, even before they enter formal schooling, we see big differences. And by the time they're 16 or 18, we see enormous differences. And then we look at them in the labor market and a bunch of other work, and we see that even after we've accounted for where they went to school and what their parents did, we still see gaps of 8 or 10% in earnings. And we kind of ask ourselves, well, what's going on? What do we do about that? And then you kind of add to this that we have been making a lot of effort for a very long time. I mean, go back to the beginning of the war on poverty. We're 60 years out. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of programs. So we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, things like Pell Grants, Head Start, TANF, WIC, SNAP. I mean, you could stand here all day and name the type of programs we have, and then at the end of the day, we kind of look at it and we still see these enormous wealth and income disparities, not just amongst adults, but amongst children and families. And we say to ourselves, well, despite all of these efforts, we now have, if you look at almost any state funding formula for schooling, you'll find that disadvantaged students are getting additional funds in the schooling formula. And still we're seeing these enormous differences. And we have to ask ourselves, this is what a lot of those folks in the room here are economists spend our time doing, is saying, well, we agree that these things exist, and in many times we've tried to correct them, and we spend a ton of money on it. We have a bunch of programs, and why aren't they working? I think that that's kind of a really important question to kind of think about. So I think that kind of I really appreciated what Professor Roemer said at the end. He said, I don't want it to be that we have equal spending for all kids in school. I want it to be that the most disadvantaged students get the most money. So when he said it, it sounded so obvious, but for some reason we don't hear people say that very often. But I think that there's maybe some comfort that as we turn on the TV when we go home and we look at what's going on in the nightly news and we hear people shouting at each other from different sides of the screen talking about exactly these types of issues. And there's one group of folks who are going to say to you, well, all of these programs haven't worked because we're creating disincentives. And then there's another group of people who are going to say, no, all these programs work is because we're not spending enough money. I wish I knew the answer, and I think that there are a lot of people who are trying to think about this, and I kind of will leave you with, I think that's the challenge that we're being faced with, is kind of as we think of the types of mechanisms, whether it's increasing taxes on income, whether it's redistributing wealth through the schooling system, increasing the social safety net, we have to try and think about which of these programs are the best way to do that, and how do we convince people to, as it was put, eat our vegetables. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for some comments or questions, and they could be addressed to everybody or anybody or some particular person. So I'm going to swipe one of these mics.
So most of the analyses that I've heard are pretty static. Can you give me some idea of how the trends are going? Are we getting better at this or are we getting worse at this? addressed to anyone.
The book to read on this question is the book by Thomas Piketty that I mentioned called Capitalism in the 21st Century. And he, can you hear?
A little bit louder. Capitalism in the
21st century. So he, it's an economic history of the last several hundred years, and he shows that in the concentration of wealth and income in the United States were very high before the First World War. I'll give you some figures in a minute. And then, as a result of the World War and the Depression, a lot of wealth was wiped out of the very wealthy. And so the distribution of wealth and income were actually most equal around 1960. And then since then, wealth has rebuilt itself, and we're now back to the levels of concentration that we were in around 1914. And Piketty predicts that that inequality is going to continue to increase in this century unless there's some big reversal of what's happening through a big social movement. Now let me give you some of these figures. Right now in the United States, according to the latest analysis, let me make the distinction first between wealth and income for those of you who aren't economists. Income is the flow that people get, you know, from working and from investing, whatever the flow is, wages, salaries, interest payments, dividends, and so on. Wealth is the accumulation, how much you save up, and you don't just put it under the mattress, you invest it, you buy a house with it, you buy other durable goods, and so on. In the United States, total wealth now is about 4.2 times annual income. Annual income, that is to say GDP, is about $17 trillion. Total wealth in the United States is about $70 trillion, about 4 times national income. What fraction of this wealth is owned by the top 1%, the wealthiest 1% of households? 41% of the total wealth is owned by the top 1%. What fraction is owned by the top decile, the wealthiest 10% of households? 70%. What fraction is owned by the bottom half of the population, the poorest half? 0. Essentially, their debts cancel out whatever savings they have as a group. The bottom 50% have essentially 0 net wealth. The so-called middle class, which is between the 50th centile and the 90th centile, have about the other 30% of the wealth. So let me take it even a smaller group at the top. The top 1/100th of a percent of the distribution, that's about 14,000 households in this country, 1/100th of 1% of all the households own about 10% of the wealth. 10%. That means the average wealth of those households is about $50 million. I just made the computation here. $50 million. Now the question is, what can be done about this? This isn't the case in all countries. In Europe, there was also a fall of concentration of wealth after the war and the Depression, but the recovery of wealth, the way it has not occurred the way it's occurred in the United States. It has also occurred in Britain, but in France, Italy, Scandinavian countries, the concentration of wealth has stayed much, much lower. What has accomplished that? How has that happened? That's been because of progressive taxation. There's much higher taxation on income at high levels, which prevents the accumulation of those huge amounts of wealth. In the Eisenhower administration, the top marginal income tax rate in the United States was over 90%. If you earned more than $1 million a year, you paid what you earned over $1 million, you paid 90% of it to the government in taxes. Now the top marginal tax rate is 39%. It's fallen tremendously in the last 30 years, beginning with the presidency of Ronald Reagan. He's the one who first started cutting these marginal tax rates. And now the very wealthy and the politicians who represent them say that if you tax the wealthy at higher levels, the wonderful economic machine we have is going to stop. But that just is not true. That's a big lie. All you have to do is look at Scandinavia, where they have very high marginal tax rates, and people live on average better than they live in the United States. There's virtually no poverty in Scandinavia, and the average person has a much better life. So it's not true that you can't tax the very top of the distribution at very high rates. It's a big lie that you can't do it, and that's the main thing that Sanders, for instance, is trying to explain to people in his campaign. So we've had a reaction to the inequality which has been growing in this country over the last 40 years, the fact that the median household has not had a real increase in its standard of living in about 30 years. There's been a right-wing reaction and a left-wing reaction to that. The right-wing reaction is typified by Trump. People are extremely angry, right? And the right-wing reaction is it's the fault of the blacks, it's the fault of the immigrants, so Trump is a racist and he's a xenophobe, right? On the other hand, you have a left-wing reaction. That's the socialist reaction. That's Sanders, who's saying, look, the reason we have this is that the policy has been wrong in this country and something else could be done. Okay? It's not surprising you have these two reactions. That's what happens when wages have been stagnant and the unemployment rate has been rising. The real unemployment rate is much higher than 5%. Because of all the people who've stopped looking for work. They should be counted as unemployed, but they're not because they're not looking for work. So the economic conditions in this country are far worse than they were for the average person 40 years ago, and less security, but people don't understand that there's something that can be done about it. That's what the presidential campaign, I think, is about. I want to say one remark to Mr. Andreason's comment about Trump. As an example of somebody who had good opportunities. Trump, in fact, inherited a huge amount of money from his father, who was a real estate mogul. Calculations have been made showing that had Trump just invested what he got as his inheritance in mutual funds, he'd be wealthier than he is now. So, in fact, he's destroyed wealth. He's a bad businessman as well as a racist. He's a bad businessman. Do you want him running the country?
This question is addressed to anybody. Talking about all this, does the United States as a nation have the capacity to increase their spending on society with a debt so high?
Yes. Yes, very
and
much.
what will that mean? I mean, how much more would we have to spend, and what would that mean for our already staggering amount of public debt?
Are you talking about investments in in social programs?
Yes.
And how much would we need to invest? I mean, I don't have the figure off the top of my head so the way we're thinking about this is not that we just redistribute wealth or we take it from one group and then drive it across town and then kind of open up the door and helicopter drop it into another group, right? So we think about investing in social programs like education is kind of what has brought a lot of this group together. But how much would it cost? It's not clear. Probably less than the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, but more than some of the smaller social programs we have now. Remember that those are investments. Those aren't things that we just take the money and then it gets burned up and we spend it. It's not like buying a television or a sofa. We're investing in something that's going to pay us back in the future, whether it's through lower crime rates or higher tax receipts in the future.
I want to say something about the debt. Think of what the debt is. The debt is largely what all of the citizens of the United States owe to people who buy U.S. bonds. Okay, most U.S. bonds, that is to say the debt of the government, are owned by Americans, actually. So it's what all of us owe to the small fraction of people who have bought a lot of U.S. bonds. Now, why did the government have to borrow by issuing bonds? Because it didn't have enough tax income to pay for the goods and services that it provides. So the easiest way of solving the debt problem is to raise taxes on the wealthy. So in other words, if you're going to provide goods and services, you have to pay for it somehow. If you collect it from people through taxes, you pay for it that way. If you don't, you have to borrow money from people. But the people you're borrowing from are largely the very wealthy. who are the ones who have the wealth to invest in the bonds, right? So the fact that we have a national debt, which is actually not that high, it's a little more than 1 year's GDP, the fact that we have a national debt is due to the fact that taxes at the high end are too low. So think of the problem of a politician. A politician wants to make people happy. So the politician has to provide goods and services. But on the other hand, people don't like to be taxed. And the wealthy have a lot of power, so they'll resist taxation very hard by buying their own politicians, right? So on the one hand, you have to provide goods and services. On the other hand, there's a significant section of politicians who will prevent the government from taxing the wealthy, so the government has no alternative but to borrow from them. So the obvious resolution is to tax them at a very high rate.
We have time for 2, maybe 3 more questions right over here.
So I want to go in a little bit of a different direction. I'm not persuaded that inequality of wealth is that big of a problem, but that aside, I think we all agree that the current system is not working for everybody in the way it should. There is drastic inequality and social mobility that's a problem. So the question then is, with the processes that we use to try to address that, and I wonder why people aren't talking about sort of more radical alternatives than we have at the moment discussed. For example, something like a universal basic income. That seems to me like it would have tremendous success and take the power away from the people that get to spend the money, so that there isn't the incentive that Dr. Roemer was just talking about to hire lawyers and whatnot to try to hire politicians even to try to dissuade them from spending the money in certain ways. If you have a universal basic income, the people can decide for themselves how to spend it, and we won't be talking about these sorts of problems with, at least on the spending side.
Well, I mean, that's probably out of my range, but I mean, the question was why aren't we talking about this? I'm sure there are plenty of people talking about all kinds of policy interventions that they like to see to deal with the problem of inequality of opportunity. But we're living in a society where we can't even get members of Congress to entertain the possibility of a hearing for a vacant Supreme Court seat. So now if we can't get that done, right, I mean, the question becomes what's the political will for some of these policies? And something else we can take away, I think, from Dr. King, looking back on his very rich legacy of engagement with many of these issues that we're talking about today, is he distinguished 3 kinds of approaches to the issue of racial progress in America. One was the approach of the optimists who thought that we more or less have reached the American dream. It's within our grasp, and so we can just sit back now and get ready to enjoy the fruits of having done so. And then there were the extreme skeptics, as he called them, who took the opposite position, saying, no way, we're not there, we're not even close. In fact, if you go read some literature in social psychology, you'll get depressed and you'll see that it probably is unattainable because people are not willing to give up their wealth and their power and their influence. And then he identified himself as a realist. And if you look at much of his philosophy, it was animated by a certain kind of pragmatism, which was rooted in the question of, what can we actually get done given the hand that we have in front of us. And so I think as we should certainly put forward all kinds of policies, but we also have to be realistic about what we can actually accomplish, given that we do live in a society under the rule of law where you got to get things done through some kind of process. Now, of course, we can decide that the whole thing sucks and try to undermine it at every turn, but Thomas Hobbes and other political philosophers had a view about what happens if we go too far in that direction. So I think that really, your question just puts the focus on these larger questions of politics, political will, and how we actually get policy on the table and in play. And this has, of course, become very difficult in our increasingly polarized society that we live in. A lot of people are talking about that for sure.
I'll just add something very short to that. I don't know how many of you have read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, but she makes a very good chronicle of the history of a lot of this stuff. And one of the arguments she makes is that if low-income people of color and low-income white people were able to join forces on some of these issues, we'd actually be able to make a difference. But the system is set up to keep low-income people of color pitted against low-income whites. And so at each time in history, in our history as a country, when those groups have started to work together, there's been something new that pops up, like Jim Crow, or like now mass incarceration and the drug policy. So that's something we want to think about as well.
Yeah, just a footnote to that, just because I spent, as I said, my whole day in the King Archives. He made this point very descriptively in a number of places. And one way he put it is that this was, again, is linked to this larger question of pragmatism and what are the prospects for coalition building. And if you look at King's thought, particularly in later years, he was very interested in finding ways to bridge gaps between us because he realized that we needed to sort of come together. But one way that working class whites and working class blacks were kept apart, as was just mentioned, was with the idea that the working class whites could at least tell themselves, at least we aren't black, right? And then that sort of gave them at least the hope that they could maybe climb the ladder of opportunity, right? Because they weren't black, and then that wouldn't work against them. So that's just a footnote. Again, I mean, King is a rich resource for us in thinking about these issues that we're still struggling with.
Time for one more question.
Yeah, if Dr. Roemer, what I wonder about is where we would get the most bang for our buck, and would you put the money, if you had it, and I'm assuming we might if Hillary gets elected, if you had money to spend, would you put it into a stimulus package and then have workers being hired at good wage jobs, or would you put it into social programs like education? I'm asking about which is the best strategy to get there quickest.
Well, that's a good question. I suppose we have to do both. The infrastructure, as you probably know, is really crumbling in this country. Engineers have estimated that we have to spend something like $3 or $4 trillion to repair the infrastructure, the roads, the highways, the ports, the bridges, and the internet. We have actually a fairly lousy service for a rich country in internet. Countries like South Korea and Japan have much better internet than we do. So I think we have to rebuild the infrastructure. $3 trillion is spent between now and 2020 is actually a fairly small amount of money. What is it? We make, as I said, GDP is about 17 trillion a year. So in the next 5 years, that'll be 85 trillion. So we're talking about spending 4 over 85. That's about, about 5 or 6% of total earnings in rebuilding infrastructure. That'll provide a lot of jobs, and it'll also make life better for people. And it'll help business because the infrastructure will be better. I think the other thing is massive early childhood education. As I mentioned, many countries in Europe have universal free childhood education from the age of 6 months. Children can be sent to creches and child care centers with good caretakers beginning at 6 months and going on, of course, through all the school years. We don't have that in this country. If you remember the figure I gave in my talk, that by the age of 3, an upper middle class child has heard 33 million years and a working class child has heard 20 million words. That's a huge difference, and that has to be fixed through supplying, through education, the exposure to words and language and reading that lots of children don't get in their homes. So education is extremely important, and I think it has to begin at that level. I mean, it's very difficult to begin to repair the deficits that people have as a result of disadvantage at the age of 16, you really have to start at the age of 2. And there's quite a lot of research now by economists. There's an economist named James Heckman at the University of Chicago who's done this work. It says you really have to start with massive publicly provided early childhood education. So I'd say those two things, rebuilding the infrastructure and early childhood education, would be two very good programs that would help a lot. And it has to be done through taxation. But as you say, how are we going to do it with the gridlock? We're not going to do it with gridlock. The reason King was a great man was that he organized a social movement to deliver the things that people needed, even though the politicians weren't supporting them. And when the social movement got big enough, then the politicians did it, right? Then LBJ turned from a Texas, a corrupt, rather, Texas politician who had a pretty racist background himself, and became a champion of civil rights and the Voting Rights Act. And that was because of the social movement that King built. And that's, I think, the only thing that's going to change things now. There has to be a social movement. We see the beginnings of it. We see some opposition, but it will eventually come maybe when the concentration of wealth becomes such that the top 10% own 90% of the wealth. We're only at 70% now, right? Maybe 90% is what is required to build a big social movement. But I think that's what will eventually occur.
Can I just one last thought about this? I mean, I certainly, I mean, the way you frame the question, I think we have to, if we had a windfall of money, do we put it into education or do we put it into social welfare? Professor Roemer says, look, we got to do a little bit of both, and that surely sounds right. But I think there's another question here we have to think about, that is, what's our commitment into, what's our commitment to investing resources that are meant to see to it that people's rights are respected and they're treated with dignity and that they're not being discriminated against and so forth and so on. And here's a perfect example of this. So we just had in 2013 the Supreme Court strike down the pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act. And they did that by invalidating Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which basically is the tool that Congress used to distinguish between states and jurisdictions that had to report to Washington, the federal government, to get pre-approval to change their voting laws. Now, one of the great virtues of that aspect of what is arguably the single most important piece of civil rights era legislation is that states had to take up the burden of showing that the changes were not going to undermine people's right to vote. Now, when that got scrapped, scholars have said, well, wait a minute, maybe we can salvage this by thinking about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, where people could still go to court and sue and say that their rights were being violated. But of course, that costs money, and it takes time. And so we need to know that society is committed to investing the resources in upholding laws that we already have on the books that are supposed to guarantee that people are getting a fair shake, they're not being treated wrongly on the basis of arbitrary characteristics like race and so forth and so on. I think that's an important part of this that gives us a wider perspective to think about these issues and disabuses us of the idea that it's just about people needing handouts for this or that, whether it's education or social welfare. No, it's also about living up to our promises and putting the money into making sure that we're doing that.